I'm a thug in an expensive suit who destroys things because it's easier than building them. That's what my fake boyfriend, a literal mafia boss, confessed to me alone in his penthouse. I'm only here because he blackmailed me over my brother's debt. He hired me to make him look respectable to high society. But the more time we spend together, the more the mask slips. He's terrifying, ruthless, and entirely obsessed with me. And the scariest part, I think I love him back.
Let us open this case file and examine our subject, Nina Vale, paralyzed in the crushing marble foyer. Almost to the untrained eye, she is a tragic heroine, clutching her brother's gambling debt. But clinically speaking, she is prey entering the domain of a true megalomaniac narcissist. Voss is a highly organized predatory intellect. His gaze locks onto hers, registering zero empathy. "You came alone," he observes, his vocal effect carefully flattened to establish dominance. "You are either remarkably brave or foolish. Stick with me, because you and I are going to unpack this psychological tragedy together." The clinical truth we see in behavioral science is absolute. To survive the darkest pathology of another human being, you must walk straight into their territory without blinking. The elevator seals Nina inside a psychological pressure chamber. Observe her frantic respiratory rate as the floors climb. 46, 47. Each chime strips away her cognitive grounding. Normal citizens do not surrender autonomy to crime lords. The doors open into a space architected to physically diminish visitors. A receptionist delivers a flat stare. "I have an appointment," Nina states, masking the autonomic nervous reaction shaking her knees. "He is expecting you." Nina steps forward into the cold stone foyer. Let this be a clinical observation. If you want to survive the echelons of sociopathic power, you must project absolute behavioral control, even when your mind is entirely consumed by primal terror. Analyze her deliberate psychological armor, a severe black dress intended to project stoic business acumen over extreme vulnerability. Her sole grounding object is a silver watch, a maternal artifact used for emotional regulation. She silently seeks absolution before breaching the heavy doors. Roman stands silhouetted against the glare, engaged in hostile verbal conditioning. "I do not care what Martinez wants," he snaps, his tone exhibiting the classic frost of dark triad traits. "Remind him what we did to the last guy." The auditory violence hits her neurobiology like physical trauma. You can rehearse a confrontation endlessly, but stepping into the physical proximity of a true predator will always shatter your baseline reality in ways you simply cannot anticipate. In his public dossier, Roman Voss is a flawless titan. Beneath that veneer, his operation relies on systemic brutality. "I will call you back," he mutters. As he pivots, he dominates the spatial environment completely. No photograph captures the sheer gravitational mass of a megalomaniac narcissist. He moves with the unhurried grace of a true apex predator. His hollow gray eyes pin her precisely where she stands. Her primal fight-or-flight response screams at her to flee, yet she forces her feet to stay anchored to the floor. Listen closely, because this is a clinical truth we must all recognize. The most lethal sociopaths rarely hide in the dark. They disguise themselves as elite royalty, and we must never let an expensive veneer blind us to their underlying predatory nature. Miss Vale. The name drops with calculated precision. It is the tone of a man possessing the power to erase her. "You are on time. That is something." She forces out a polite thank you. "Did I give you a choice?" he counters, the trap snapping shut. "Sit." Nina sinks into the chair, clutching her dossier as a barrier. Observe the violent topography of his life, the scarred jaw, the hands conditioned for trauma. Your brother Roman begins with agonizing slowness, is a complete idiot. Shame floods Nina's system as she agrees. Know why? He asks, sliding a file across the desk. Because Josh walked into my club and burned cash he never had. The diagnostic lesson is absolute. Never gamble with the resources of a predator who can effortlessly dismantle your existence. He lost $60,000 his first week, Roman states, devoid of pity. Did he stop? No. Nina's knuckles whiten. Her brother believed he could outsmart a syndicate. When my men cut him off, he owed $243,000. He pushes a paper forward. Plus interest, $296,000. The room tilts violently. The room tilts violently. He does not have that, she whispers. No kidding, Roman either, she confesses. Roman analyzes her micro-expressions. So why are you here? Think I would fold for a pretty face? I came to negotiate, she fires back. Here is a vital psychiatric truth. When you hold the weakest hand, owning your reality with unshakable confidence is your greatest weapon. Negotiate, Roman repeats, dark amusement crossing his features. Josh made a mistake, Nina pleads. I own a ballet studio, valued at $70,000. She slides the deed across the desk. My record is flawless. His crushing tone severs her momentum. I am offering collateral, she stammers. You would trade your life's work for a poker debt? Roman asks, tossing the deed back. The studio you started at 19 using your dead mother's life insurance. The revelation strikes her like a physical blow. He has already dissected her entire psychological profile. She feels surgically exposed. I am offering everything, she insists. Remember this clinical boundary. Never sacrotoxic wreckage generated by someone else. To clean up the toxic wreckage generated by someone else. I will do whatever you require, she begs, showing early signs of a trauma bond. Translation? Anything. I will work off his debt. At what rate? Roman counters. Say I value you at $100,000 a year. That is 3 years just to clear the principal. Can your studio survive without you? No, Nina whispers. I will find a way. She lies. You and I have probably both seen someone burn themselves alive to save a drowning victim. You will lose everything, Roman states with clinical precision. After 3 years, you will just have a useless brother who knows you will bleed to fix his mess. His logic is an agonizing, sharpened blade. The psychiatric lesson is absolute. Enabling a destructive person never cures them. It simply guarantees your own downfall. Imagine we are observing this from behind a two-way mirror. Nina fights back tears. Then, what do you suggest, she demands, hating the fracture in her voice. Just let you kill him? Roman pivots with sociopathic grace. I do not execute people over debts dead men cannot pay. He leans against the desk. But I require consequences. Your brother must learn that bad choices carry a massive tax. His gay survives means nothing to me. Whether he survive out means nothing to me. I only care about maintaining systemic order. Nina curls her fingers, suppressing her fight response. So what happens now? She asks. Roman slowly picks up her deed. That depends entirely on you. The psychological takeaway is sharp. Unearned mercy is always processed as a fatal weakness. You walked in ready to negotiate. Roman observes, his mind ought to spine. Then most. I am not terrifying the men. She fires Max back. It is a fabricated defense, and both know it. Roman allows a chilling smile to surface. It is a masterclass in psychological dread. You really should be, he whispers. But let us pretend you are exactly as brave as you act. He circles the desk, deliberately breaching her personal boundaries. I will present an offer. Take it, or let Josh drown. Nina swallows past a dry throat, her nervous system redlining. What kind of offer? She rasps. The kind that keeps your brother breathing and your studio open. The lesson is profound. When cornered by a predator, faking bravery is often the only shield you have left. Roman assesses her with the detachment of a scientist examining a specimen. I have a problem. You might be the asset to fix it. Nina forces down her panic. What kind of problem? Roman gestures toward the skyline. Public perception. I possess absolute power, but lack respectability. He has a narcissist compulsion for legitimacy, but his violent history keeps elite doors bolted. You want me to make you look respectable? Nina asks, stunned. He does not blink. I need you to convince society I belong. You want to hire me as an escort? She snaps. I want to hire exactly what you are. He corrects with sociopathic precision. A woman possessing genuine cultural class. The reality is clinically undeniable. Wealth can purchase an army, but it can never manufacture a spotless reputation. You will attend elite events by my side, Roman instructs, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. You will be exactly as authentic as you are right now. You will also reside in the penthouse 3 floors down. The room spins as Nina grips the desk. Live with you, she gasps, near me. Not with me. He corrects with surgical precision. He outlines the terms. 6 months of absolute behavioral loyalty. In return, he erases the debt, funds her studio, and pays $10,000 a month. Why me? She whispers, betraying her psychological terror. Roman steps closer, his dead eyes pinning her. Stick with me here, because this clinical observation teaches a terrifying truth. Sometimes the salvation we beg for arrives looking exactly like a beautifully wrapped, inescapable trap. Let us open this psychiatric file and examine the tension of this frame. Roman displays textbook megalomaniacal narcissism. Leaning across the mahogany table, he deliberately violates her spatial boundaries. He does not desire an equal. He actively targets her bleeding desperation, intending to weaponize her trauma bond to a toxic sibling. The conditioning begins with an absolute wager. 6 months of submission. If her psyche shatters, her brother owes $296,000 by midnight, payable in blood. You and I must recognize this haunting truth. Blind familial loyalty usually exacts a fatal psychological toll. Nina sits paralyzed, experiencing an acute autonomic freeze response, whispering her surrender. Roman offers no comfort, only a razor-sharp smirk. Roman studies his new subject with a gaze devoid of human empathy, reminding her that massive debts never simply evaporate. In his distorted cognitive framework, he believes he is providing a benevolence her brother never earned. Nina exhibits severe physiological tremors, the word blackmail spilling from her lips. To a man exhibiting dark triad traits, this coercion is just structural business. He installs a rigid deadline of exactly 5 o'clock for her total surrender. The devaluation phase begins immediately as he critiques her clothing, promising to reconstruct her identity. We often forget this clinical lesson in power dynamics. By the time a psychological predator permits you a moment to process the danger, the steel teeth of the trap have already locked firmly into your mind. The psychological descent manifests both literally and cognitively. An enforcer presses a legal dossier into Nina's trembling hands. She experiences acute dissociation riding the elevator down 63 floors. On the pavement, the city carries on with brutal indifference. Her phone vibrates with frantic calls from Josh, his voice reduced to dysregulated sobs. He babbles about fixing his mistakes, but Nina declares she must erase his ledger immediately. It is a bitter lesson we observe in endless case files. The architects of chaos rarely suffer the consequences, leaving the innocent to absorb the trauma. She stares up at the towering glass monument, fully aware. A megalomaniac sits high above, clinically calculating his absolute domination over her existence. Nina severs the call, carrying this 47-page legal nightmare into a coffee shop to cognitively process the trap. The positive reinforcement mechanisms are staggering. 6 months of obedience yields a luxury penthouse, $10,000 a month, and financial backing for her studio. Her brother avoids physical mutilation, but the fine print is a psychological horror story of ironclad silencing agreements and isolation protocols. Consider this a stark warning for all of us. When an arrangement presents as a sudden miracle, the pathological predator is usually smiling in the footnotes. Nina reads on, feeling the cold weight of invisible restraints locking tightly around her psyche. She is consciously trading her fundamental human autonomy for blood-stained syndicate. Capital. The behavioral trap tightens violently on page 34. A buried clause explicitly mandates that this arrangement carries immense physical danger. She must submit to his armed guards without question, or the agreement shatters. Roman omitted the brutal reality that his competitors negotiate through ballistic violence. Her device illuminates with a chilling message. Your decision, Miss Vale? It carries only his initials. Nina experiences severe cognitive dissonance gazing at her quiet dance studio where ordinary mothers drop off children. The environmental contrast is clinically jarring. We must realize that sometimes a subject feels they have no choice but to step willingly into devouring pathological darkness just to protect the fragile slivers of light they truly love. She officially discards her baseline existence, messaging the syndicate to inspect her cage. The authoritative response grants her exactly 1 hour. This 60th floor residence is a high-altitude compound of towering glass and dizzying drops. Her primary handler is Marcus, a man possessing incongruously gentle eyes set within the immense mass of an enforcer. Marcus reveals that Roman redesigned the environment specifically for her psychological comfort. It previously projected the cold chrome of isolated pathological masculinity. Now it operates as a perfectly tailored grooming mechanism. It reminds us of a bitter clinical truth. True psychological captivity is rarely a rusted iron cell. More often, it is a beautifully constructed illusion lined with crushed velvet. Marcus permits a micro-expression of amusement, noting the critique of the chrome decor was his own. Despite the crushing cortisol levels in her system, Nina nearly laughs. He leads her into the primary bedroom, unveiling a closet stocked with elite garments, every piece tailored exactly to her dimensions. The megalomaniac operates with terrifying precision. Marcus hands her a keycard with strict behavioral boundaries, locking her out of Roman's private sanctuary. When she questions what operates beneath them, Marcus's effect hardens, instructing her to look away. We must remember that the secrets we refuse to acknowledge are usually the anomalies that destroy us. He establishes her new threat baseline, stating plainly that as the boss's acquired asset, she is a highly visible target. Marcus slides a communication card across the marble counter, establishing himself as her crisis liaison. Nina accepts the lifeline, scanning this architectural fortress. It is the most secure structure in the city, but the entry toll is exactly 6 months of her human autonomy. Her device vibrates. 4:30. She has 30 minutes before the window collapses. Gazing down at the skyline, she visualizes the panic drowning her sibling. Far below, her employees are oblivious that she is standing in the clouds, debating a psychological pact with an antisocial predator. Life often teaches us that raw survival requires us to willingly embrace the very pathology that terrifies us most. Regulating her nervous system, she dials the number. The dawn answers on the first ring. The silence on the line radiates the calculated authority. Roman wears like psychological armor. Nina anchors her physiology and establishes her single fragile boundary. Her brother can never discover the truth of this trauma bond. He must believe he is bound to a strict financial plan. The enabling pathology here is profoundly tragic, yet clinically necessary. You and I know this behavioral pattern well. If we continuously shield individuals from the consequences of their actions, they never learn to survive the flood. The line remains quiet before Roman emits a predatory vocalization of approval. With the contract sealed, his affect reverts to absolute ice. Marcus will extract her at 7 tomorrow morning. Pack light. Her first cognitive stress test begins tomorrow evening. Before her adrenaline spike recedes, Josh floods her screen with frantic messages. Nina responds with devastating clinical detachment, stating the crisis is contained via a payment plan. When his dysregulated apologies pour in, she accepts the finality of her isolation, deleting the thread and blocking his access entirely. It is an excruciating behavioral reality. Sometimes, violently severing the emotional cord is the only method left to save a destructive individual from themselves. Pivoting rapidly, she dials her manager, forcing manufactured enthusiasm into her vocal cords to construct an elaborate fiction about securing a wealthy private client. The moment this narrative is accepted, Nina signs the syndicate documentation, permanently sealing her psychological fate. Rebecca calls to verify the transaction's finality. The debt is erased and survival funds transfer by midnight. Following a chilling welcome, the connection terminates. Nina's nervous system crashes. She collapses, struggling to remember the mechanics of respiration. Outside, the bruised sunset perfectly mirrors the megalomaniac who just purchased her autonomy. Morning arrives with violent psychological speed. Marcus knocks at exactly 6:45. Glancing at rationalization, she offers a rationalization about retrieving her belongings later. Holding on to foundational roots is often the only cognitive anchor available when reality is violently upended. Yet, as she steps into the elevator, the crushing gravitational force of her captivity entirely takes hold. Step into this penthouse with me, because the moment those doors part, systematic psychological warfare initiates. There is no reception, only a controlling directive on the marble. Be flawless by 6:30. Roman is methodically dismantling her independence through rigid scheduling. Nina unpacks, placing a worn photograph of her mother on the nightstand as a fragile cognitive anchor. At 9, a ruthless technician sweeps in, declaring her mandate is to ensure Nina does not embarrass the Dawn. She circles her subject like a secondary predator, reducing her entirely to biometric measurements. It is a profoundly dehumanizing spectacle, yet it teaches us as a vital defensive mechanism. When pathological forces shove you into a space designed to strip your identity, the only path to psychological survival is to plant your feet and absolutely refuse to be erased. Margaret functions like a forensic technician preparing a body. Tonight is the gala, an arena where pathological elites purchase societal validation. Roman Voss issues his directive with the detachment of a megalomaniac. Nina must project absolute compliance. Under the vanity lighting, she is processed like contraband. The emerald gown and heavy diamonds are not gifts. They are instruments of psychological subjugation. Roman demands flawless execution. When the icy stones lock around her throat, the suffocating reality of her captivity takes root. This presents a haunting behavioral truth. You can encase a subject in the most exquisite wealth meth imaginable, but it will never mask the desperate, traumatized human psyche suffocating just beneath the polished surface. Today, you and I are going to unpack the architecture of this psychological cage together. Observe Nina before the mirror as Margaret drops her manufactured affect. She delivers a grim masterclass in survival, detailing Roman's syndicate. Her clinical advice centers on cognitive reframing. Weaponize their assumptions. Let the predators see a fragile victim and use that perceived weakness to gather intelligence. Nina grips the table, registering this as a brutal stress test. Margaret leaves behind a safe coded to Nina's birth date, proving Roman has mapped her most intimate data. This blatant privacy violation forces a chilling realization. The most devastating psychological traps are almost always constructed using the personal vulnerabilities we carelessly leave exposed. As the room darkens, Nina memorizes her captors like a hostage studying floor plans. By 6 in the evening, her baseline identity has vanished. She has reconstructed herself as a polished asset, engineered to survive the toxic orbit of a megalomaniacal narcissist. A sterile text initiates her descent. Glancing at the ghost of her former self, she enters the elevator. Below, Marcus idles in a black sedan, offering a rare display of empathy. He notes her transformation, and she softly verbalizes her acute anxiety. This transit mirrors a prisoner's transport to a secure facility. It exposes a profound tragedy of behavioral adaptation. True survival often requires us to entirely suppress our authentic emotional core just to endure the dangerous environments we cannot escape. A stress response peaks when your pulse drowns out external sound. Nina spends the transport suppressing a panic cycle. Ascending the staircase, she locates Roman. He adjusts his cuffs with the chilling flat effect of a man who dismantles lives daily. His gaze registers a possessive, narcissistic pride. Nina attempts a deflection, crediting the stylist. Invading her space, Roman coldly asserts that he purchased the aesthetic. His knuckles deliberately graze the diamonds at her throat, a calculated gesture of physical subjugation. He owns the stones, and psychologically, he believes he owns her. It establishes a fundamental behavioral law. Allowing another entity to finance your existence guarantees they will dictate the boundaries of your personal freedom. As his skin contacts her collarbone, her core temperature drops. Roman registers her tremors with a predatory smirk, classifying her fear as a marker of intelligence. He offers his arm as a tactical restraint, mandating emotional suppression and total paranoia. Nina observes his profile, hyper-aware that half the subjects here actively plot his murder while the rest exhibit submissive avoidance. She questions her assigned psychological role. Roman coldly notes that human imagination is a far superior manipulation tool than truth. He pulls her into the lights toward high-status predators. This forces a clinical realization. The most debilitating trauma a subject carries is usually the invisible psychological conditioning hidden entirely from the public eye. You and I must evaluate this environment from a clinical standpoint. The sensory input strikes Nina's nervous system like blunt trauma. It is an overwhelming concentration of the criminal elite. Nina utilizes her gown as a psychological barrier. Roman anchors his hand at her lower spine, simulating the physical marking of territory. He issues a directive to project social dominance. When she verbalizes her inadequacy, he coldly instructs her to fabricate a better lie. His focus isolating an aging sociopath exhibiting a deadened affect. The pack behavior activates. This confirms a stark sociological fact. In any hierarchy, the cognitive ability to mask your internal panic from observing predators. Hastings initiates a calculated stressor, deploying microaggressions about Roman's status. He escalates to a physical boundary violation, trapping Nina's fingers to observe her response, questioning her attachment to a psychopath. Roman's motor functions instantly freeze, a classic pre-assault indicator in violent offenders. Fascinatingly, Nina intercepts the aggression with a textbook trauma response adaptation. To prevent escalation, she fabricates a sharp narrative about Roman's affinity for ballet. Hastings counters, mocking Roman's history of blunt force trauma. This exchange is a case study in antisocial conflict. It proves that the most lethal threats in the sociopathic spectrum do not brandish firearms. The Sproking type, they operate seamlessly while holding crystal glassware. The psychological warfare enters a volatile phase. Roman lowers his vocal register, using targeted cognitive dismantling to eviscerate the older male's strategy. Maintaining a flat affect, Roman shatters Hastings' ego constructs. Exerting physical coercion, he steers his captive away like a detached apex predator. When Nina processes the interaction as traumatic, Roman categorizes the abuse as standard procedure. He redirects her hypervigilance toward Catherine Weller. Catherine projects an authoritative baseline that instantly alters the room's group dynamics. This behavior models an established principle of clinical power hierarchies. Absolute dominance does not require aggressive vocalization. Its sheer psychological mass simply forces weaker subjects into compliant orbits. Catherine engages with predatory precision, probing anomalies in Roman's profile. Surprisingly, the megalomaniac exhibits a drop in cortisol, mimicking genuine warmth. Catherine bypasses this, locking a diagnostic gaze on the captive. Upon hearing the name Nina Vale, the matriarch experiences a visible autonomic shock. She extracts the data. Is she the offspring of Maria Vale? The confirmation triggers a severe somatic response in Nina. The hardened matriarch's psychological defenses fracture as she recalls the mother's distinct traits. This disruption of the environmental baseline verifies a chronic clinical reality. Regardless of the evasive coping mechanisms you deploy, generational trauma and familial history will invariably surface to disrupt your current behavioral patterns. Roman pivots the conversation to deflect the emotional trigger. Catherine tests the captive's rationalization skills, questioning why a civilian associates with a high-risk offender. Nina's survival mechanism activates, rationalizing that artistic endeavors require sociopathic funding. Catherine issues a coded warning about Roman's destructive tendencies. Roman then administers a chemical depressant to stabilize Nina's nervous system. When she questions the prevalence of authentic attachments in his network, he quantifies them at near zero. The rest operate on pure terror conditioning. This clinically diagnoses his core pathology. Narcissists construct impenetrable fortresses of intimidation because they possess a paralyzing, deep-seated phobia of authentic human vulnerability. Roman conducts a visual sweep, his threat detection functioning at maximum capacity. Positive reinforcement holds zero value for his pathology. Engineered fear is his sole metric. Yet, we observe the onset of a trauma bond. Nina bypasses his hostile affect, analyzing his suppressed emotional deficits. She verbalizes the extreme psychological isolation of his life. His auditory processing halts. He challenges her assessment, questioning the utility of attachment. She insists exhibiting empathy for her captor. She insists all human brains are hardwired for connection, even those frozen in defense states. Stick with me here. We routinely classify violent offenders as monsters, willfully ignoring the severe developmental trauma that originally militarized their nervous systems. Nina experiences severe somatic stress during the dining phase, compounding her psychological exhaustion. She sits next to David Chen, a subject exhibiting rare prosocial behaviors. His low baseline anxiety is startling in a room saturated with psychopaths. David notes her flight or fight readiness, classifying her inability to mask as an anomaly. Nina deploys an avoidance strategy, redirecting to her civilian occupation. David reciprocates with a domestic anecdote about his child. In an ecosystem governed entirely by coercive control, a standard reciprocal interaction feels profoundly jarring. It provides a clear clinical takeaway. Even within severely pathological environments, the human brain's desperate hunger for normal psychological attachment remains completely irrepressible. Let us open this case file together. For exactly 20 minutes, the subject Nina displays a drop in cortisol. Her shoulders relax into a normal conversation with David. Then the physical anchor drops. Roman's hand descends on her bare knee. You and I have seen this in maximum security wards. It is not affection. It is the branding iron of a megalomaniac narcissist establishing dominance. He surgically excises David with a fabricated lie, then whispers a toxic warning into Nina's ear, isolating her. The clinical takeaway here is hauntingly simple. In a world of fractured predators, a pure, unprompted act of kindness is always categorized as the deadliest trap of all. Roman articulates his methodology with chilling precision. His physical touch is a broadcast mechanism signaling absolute ownership. Nina attempts to assert autonomy, hissing through a forced smile that she is nobody's property. Roman's baseline never fluctuates. He maintained dead eye contact and ruthlessly informs her that for 6 months she is his exact possession. The gala devolves into a manic display of excess, yet Roman buys nothing. He merely uses his dark gravity to keep his victim tethered. In the sterile silence of the car, his assessment of her performance is coldly transactional. It illustrates a tragic psychological reality. We frequently exhaust our entire psychic reserves, fighting the very chains we willingly locked around our own wrists. Let us observe how a mastermind conducts a post-mortem. Roman locks his deadened eyes onto hers, surgically dismantling the social dynamics. He notes Catherine's favor, Chen's probing, and Hastings's manipulation. He clinically validates Nina's flawless performance. Though she deflects, Roman reads the elevated pulse at her carotid artery. He diagnoses her anger perfectly. She resents that he marked his territory before a crowd that now assumes sexual intimacy. When she challenges him, his affect remains flat, bluntly stating he never pays for intimacy. Perception is his primary currency. Here is a lesson seen in every pathological case. Sometimes our strongest armor is simply the grand lie we force the rest of the world to believe. Roman delivers his rationale with the attachment of a cartel boss. To his network, she must appear untouchable to prevent a gang war. By claiming her publicly, he ensures her physical survival. Here is where we see the early mechanics of Stockholm Syndrome take root. Nina's furious hostility suddenly dissolves into a dependent ache. Arriving at the high-rise, they find Marcus with extra security. Roman casually dismisses the constant peril as a standard hazard. He then violates her spatial boundary, following her inside as she removes her agonizing shoes. It reinforces a grim psychological law. We build massive structural walls to keep the outside monsters at bay, only to realize the true danger is already standing right inside our home. Moving to the bar, Roman offers a pour. Nina cites her strict one-glass protocol. He smoothly invalidates this boundary, framing the rule as only necessary for external predators. In his territory, she is off the clock. Nina collapses onto the sofa, physically suffering from the cognitive load of her deception. She asks if anyone in his violent subculture ever truly rests. Instead of answering, he hands her a dry red wine. It is her exact preferred vintage. A megalomaniac narcissist collects data like a weapon. Despite her internal alarms, she accepts the drink. This highlights a fundamental human frailty. We spend our lives holding heavy masks perfectly in place, completely forgetting how intoxicating it feels when we finally let them drop. You and I must analyze this pivotal escalation. Roman admits her charm unlocked old money vaults his dark reputation could never access. When she questions his interest in gossip, he coldly counters that his empire requires their silent submission. Then, the psychological tactic pivots. He tells her she is the first companion who did not appear bought, she seemed authentic. Nina drinks the wine, battling pure fear, profound exhaustion, and a dangerous spark of validation. This is the seduction of the captor. We all know the danger of playing a flawless role. The real terror arrives when a predator bypasses the act and recognizes the fragile pathology underneath. Shattering the silence, Roman stares directly into her pupils and demands to know exactly what happened to her mother. Nina grips her glass with white-knuckled intensity, a somatic response to trauma. 3 years have passed since cancer eradicated her mother. Raised by an overextended single parent, Nina developed an obsessive drive to succeed in ballet as a form of retroactive compensation. But here is the clinical reality. Sometimes, maximum effort yields zero return. Nina lacked the physiological markers for a soloist. Her rejections coincided exactly with the terminal diagnosis. Her mother forbade wasting resources on futile treatments, demanding Nina open a studio instead. A singular tear breaches her defenses before this apex predator. It proves that enduring legacies are never built on grand successes, but on the resilient love that survives our most crushing failures. The studio is Nina's pathological anchor to the deceased. Roman observes her as she details her codependent bond with Josh, her reckless half-brother. Pouring more wine, Roman delivers a brutal psychiatric assessment. Josh is 21, fully capable of his own ruin, and Nina is not his mother. When she rationalizes that the boy is her only surviving attachment, Roman's gaze flatlines. He clinically dismantles her delusion, stating it is a massive lie she uses for self-soothing. This violent emotional debridement shatters her carefully constructed defenses. She retreats, sarcastically thanking him for the uninvited therapy. It uncovers a harsh developmental truth. We can never heal our own lingering trauma by endlessly carrying the dead weight of individuals who actively refuse to save themselves. Roman's low voice trails after her, noting she performed better than she calculated. Nina grieves the autonomous identity she possessed. Before, Roman's coercive control consumed her. At daylight, the cognitive dissonance resumes. Margaret delivers curated garments to soften Roman's optics for an investor dinner. When Nina asks if the kingpin is actually developing empathy, Margaret issues a grim warning. Statistically, dangerous men do not soften, they merely evolve their camouflage. Strapping on the navy dress is akin to equipping tactical gear. Entering the exclusive venue, a chilling behavioral pattern emerges. We frequently modify our external variables to survive hostile environments, but our core pathology remains static. We simply learn exactly where to conceal the blade. Nina scans the environment. Roman is surrounded by corporate entities like Carlyle, Park, and Whitmore, men entirely devoid of effective empathy. As introductions occur, their predatory gaze assesses her for structural weaknesses. Carlyle deploys a microaggression disguised as a compliment. He calls her studio admirable, yet his inflection minimizes her life's work against Roman's vast syndicate. It is a classic dominance test. Rather than displaying a submissive posture, Nina maintains steady eye contact. She logically counters that all operational theaters require absolute, unforgiving discipline. Her response illustrates a critical benchmark in self-actualization. True psychological fortitude is never about frantically proving your worth in someone else's arena. It is about fiercely establishing the unyielding parameters of your own domain. Under the amber lighting, Nina notes that ballet demands sheer kinesthetic precision, hypothesizing that finance requires the same. Park scoffs, asserting their failures only destroy portfolios, not physical bodies. Notice Roman's behavior here. He exhibits the stillness of an ambush predator, allowing his targets to expose their positions before closing the trap. Suddenly, Carlyle's phone interrupts. The executive's face structurally collapses at a text from his adolescent daughter. Exhibiting deep paternal distress, he asks Neat's Nina if raising girls ever stabilizes. She offers a regulated, grounding smile. Not really, she notes, categorizing it as a standard boundary test. This is a fundamental human drive we study constantly. We routinely push our primary attachments away, simply to test if they possess the resilience to stay. Let us look at this together. The behavioral analysis here is fascinating. Carlyle, a dominant corporate entity, is stripped of his defensive posturing by simple parental terror. Though Nina lacks biological children, managing dysregulated youth has taught her the clinical art of de-escalation. Her directive is efficient. Call the subject and engage in active listening. 15 minutes later, Carlyle returns his baseline fully restored. The adolescent merely required a safe extraction. Beneath the table, Roman's hand finds Nina's. This touch is different. It is a silent transmission of professional respect. They easily close the financial traps before dessert. It leaves us with a profound diagnostic truth. Beneath our sharpest, most aggressive armor, we rarely require complex interventions. We simply possess a desperate biological need to feel genuinely heard. In my clinical observation, Roman studies his target with the dark fascination of a megalomaniac narcissist. He reframes her genuine empathy as a calculated strategy because his pathology cannot process simple kindness. Nina rejects this, offering raw, like his, honesty. Honesty is a dangerous anomaly. A sudden phone call shatters the moment. His physiological shift is immediate. The affective empathy vanishes, leaving only a hollow stare. He dictates that Marcus will take her home, retreating behind the rigid boundaries of their contract. He steps into the city's shadows, leaving Nina to rationalize the violence he is about to commit. This is the exact genesis of Stockholm Syndrome. You and I must understand this simple truth. When we stop fearing the fire, we inevitably burn. The environment shifts to a sterile, high society art gallery. Roman glides through the space, executing a flawless performance of the refined patron. He purchases 3 canvases from a novice without checking the price. This is not generosity. This is pure architectural masking. The narcissist is carefully constructing a pristine public persona to offset his internal decay. When Nina questions a shield for his philanthropy is merely a shield for his violent reality, his jaw tightens. A defensive reflex. He insists the purchases prove he is more than his criminal profile. He desperately needs her to validate his delusion. It reveals a tragic reality about human psychology. We all construct masks to navigate the world safely, but the broken individuals will spend everything they have to convince themselves the disguise is real. The sociopathic illusion shatters when Evelyn enters the space. She stares at Nina with contempt, reducing her to a temporary object. Roman intervenes, his tone razor-sharp, asserting control by labeling Nina his companion. Evelyn is unfazed. She drops a devastating accusation, exposing how Roman destroyed her lease after facing romantic rejection. A classic retaliatory strike from a bruised ego. Roman dismisses it as strictly business, but Nina can feel his body hardening into concrete. Evelyn warns Nina that men with his pathology only collect beautiful things to eventually destroy them. Roman looks entirely capable of murder in this moment. We see the terrifying reality of unresolved trauma. Our past decisions leave dark echoes, and eventually our ugliest ghosts will always return to collect what they are owed. Evelyn departs, leaving behind a suffocating debris field of ruined trust. Roman vibrates with a silent, terrifying rage, his hand clamping around Nina's wrist as he extracts her from the gallery. Once inside his penthouse, the polished executive persona completely shatters. He paces the dark floor like a cornered predator, frantically insisting Evelyn is lying. He is experiencing a severe narcissistic collapse. Nina observes him with a perfectly steady gaze, offering a gentle nod. When he desperately demands to know if she believes him, she placates him by blaming Evelyn's bitterness. Nina is actively protecting her captor. You and I must recognize a tragic truth here in this clinical observation. Deep, unhealed wounds will eventually twist even the most honest human soul into a desperate, rationalizing liar. Nina deliberately dismisses the accusation, further cementing her trauma bond. Roman steps closer, projecting the full, oppressive weight of his criminal empire. He asks if she sees a monster who destroys women out of spite. She holds his gaze. While the violence of his antisocial world is undeniable, she focuses entirely on the care he has shown her. She chooses to perceive a buried humanity beneath the megalomaniac myth. Roman warns her of her naivety, attempting to maintain his dominant position. But her pulse races as she drops her defensive armor. She issues a piercing psychological ultimatum. If he truly craves redemption, he must practice goodness in the shadows. This is a fundamental law of human behavior. True integrity is forever defined by the moral choices we make when absolutely no one is watching. Roman is paralyzed by her demand. The silence swells, threatening to shatter the room. He retreats, a hollow laugh scraping his throat as he defends his pathology. He admits his empire was cemented with pure terror, confessing that his destructive impulses are far easier to execute than genuine repair. But Nina refuses to validate his helplessness. She clinically points out that a brutal behavioral history is not a permanent life sentence, then leaves him in the dark. By morning, he reasserts his control. A crisp envelope arrives at her door, ordering her to wear a specific silver dress at 5. The cycle continues. Listen closely, because this psychological pattern matters. True personal growth almost always begins in that exact, terrifying second when we finally step off the edge into the absolute unknown. The morning note offers zero apologies for the emotional wreckage he caused. This lack of remorse is a hallmark of his narcissistic structure. He completely ignores how she exposed the vulnerability he spent decades suppressing. Nina's hands tremble as she crumples the paper. Desperate for a cognitive anchor, she calls Sarah, praying a normal conversation will regulate her nervous system. But when Sarah notices her exhaustion, Nina instantly deflects, forcing a brittle smile. This highlights a devastating psychological reality. A suffocating isolation takes root the moment lying to our loved ones becomes a survival mechanism. By late afternoon, the quiet apartment breaks her resolve. She surrenders to his control. The silver dress on her bed is no longer mere fabric. It has become her gleaming, necessary armor. The silver gown transforms her into an elegant phantom, fully assimilating her into his clinical environment. She rides the elevator to his sanctuary, while the dying sun paints the city in brocades of gold. Upon entering, she finds Roman rigid behind his desk, glaring at the top as if willing it to combust. A tense muscle ticks in his jaw, signaling severe internal distress. When he finally looks at her, the violent storm within his mind seems to break. He quietly notes her early arrival and shuts the device with a heavy sigh. The untouchable apex predator completely vanishes. He just looks utterly exhausted. He looks entirely human. We so often forget this basic truth, do we not? Beneath the most terrifying behavioral facades, people are almost always fighting silent, exhausting emotional battles. The camera slowly pans as Roman drifts to the grand windows, his broad shadow suffocating the fading light. He mutters Evelyn's name. Nina whispers that the woman simply thrived on theatrics. Roman slices the dead air with a jagged breath. When he pivots, the sheer agony carved into his face is jarring. He drops his armor entirely, confessing he chose violence because blood offered the fastest route to power. Nina freezes. Then the killing blow. Evelyn was right. He ruined her gallery just because it was a minor inconvenience. You can see his heavy fists trembling over the fragile lives he casually shattered. Nina barely breathes, asking why he is sharing this darkness now. He stares at her, broken. Because you believed I could be better. It leaves you and me with a simple lesson. Vulnerability requires the ultimate courage. Shadows cling to the sharp angles of Roman's face. His voice, coarse as crushed glass, carries the rare weight of genuine regret. He insists his neural pathways are fixed, that he cannot simply decide to become a righteous man. But Nina refuses to enable this cognitive distortion. She steps closer. She accuses him of being terrified of normalcy, entirely addicted to his own ruthless, megalomaniac myth. If he truly thrives in the dark, she asks, why does he confess his sins to her? Roman turns to stone. The faint tremor in his jaw betrays the sheer psychological exhaustion of maintaining his fractured persona. She begs him to drop the monstrous act. It is a profound clinical reality. The hardest prison a human being will ever try to escape is the one built from the heavy bricks of their own crushing guilt. Nina actively blocks his attempt to drown in the comfort of self-pity. She forces him to analyze his own capacity for mercy. As a syndicate leader, he held absolute power and could have easily exploited her, yet he deliberately chose restraint. She frames this behavioral choice as the true measure of his psyche. Roman deflects, muttering that basic decency is a pathetic metric. Nina fires back, insisting that every recovery from trauma requires an initial step. His stoic mask finally fractures under the sheer weight of her persistent empathy. Suddenly, his phone vibrates, and the violent reality of his life returns. Pulling up to Catherine's estate, he issues a cold survival protocol. We must always remember this lesson. Our true character is never defined by the power we hold, but by the harm we actively choose to withhold. We observe Nina standing before the colossal oak doors, her respiration hitching in a textbook panic response. She must now perform this fabricated romance for a room full of apex predators. Roman turns slowly, the harsh light revealing a surprising softening in his usually dead eyes. He tells her to say whatever she wants, effectively relinquishing his need for control. Let us examine this together, you and I, because it is incredibly unnerving when a paranoid man hands over the keys to his reality. Inside, the environment is saturated with old money and malice. Nina forces her spine straight, deploying a calculated smile as a defense mechanism. But the unseen emotional toll is staggering. Every time we carve away our authenticity to survive a vicious room, we permanently lose a fragile fragment of our own soul. The room is illuminated by glaring chandeliers, humming with the hollow, performative laughter of the elite. When an art director mentions her mother with genuine reverence, and Nina's physiological tension finally releases, a real smile breaks through her clinical masking. Catherine capitalizes on this warmth, praising Nina's dance studio. In the background, Roman remains a calculated anchor of shadow. The megalomaniac syndicate boss entirely cedes the spotlight, his cold eyes scanning the perimeter for behavioral threats. He radiates no malice in this setting, only a heavy, immovable sense of security. This perfectly illustrates a quiet truth of human psychology. The fiercest protectors rarely feel the need to roar. The most profound security comes from the silent weight of someone simply choosing to stand guard in your corner. The quiet dinner masks the predatory dynamics of this gathering. I've analyzed this pathology in max security wards for years. Nina sits by Diane, who dangles funding for her programs like psychological bait. Nina feels a sharp adrenaline spike, finding her dream inside a snake pit. You and I will unpack this case together, as it illustrates how targets are groomed. Across the table, Roman watches her. We see the megalomaniac narcissist feeding on her gratitude, his cold eyes mimicking genuine pride. This manufactured warmth shatters instantly when Catherine abruptly interrogates Roman about his illicit syndicates. It reveals a harsh clinical baseline. Environments structured around fear will always suffocate the innocent, no matter how quiet the room gets. Roman absorbs the hostility without a single micro-expression of distress. His pulse remains steady as he calmly explains his pivot into legitimate real estate. A politician aggressively interrupts, dragging Roman's violent criminal history out into the open. Roman offers a calculated assertion that a man can evolve. Then Helen verbally strikes. With a venomous laugh, she diagnoses his saintly act as a mere performance to captivate his hostage, the dance teacher. Turning to Nina, Helen surgically dismantles the illusion, detailing how Roman shattered a young woman's jaw to extort his first million. The elegant table descends into absolute psychological chaos. It is an unavoidable diagnostic reality. Past violence can never be outrun. It will always breach the surface. Helen leans in, diagnosing him as a mere thug in a tailored suit. Watch Roman's physical tells. His knuckles whiten, the only leak in his rigid control. His vocal register drops to an icy calm. He makes no defensive rationalizations. Looking dead ahead, he openly confesses to the monstrous violence of his youth. The room stops breathing. Nina is locked in an acute trauma response. Completely paralyzed, Roman declares his brutal methodology retired. He freely admits he lacks a moral compass, acknowledging that unchecked violence simply threatens his legacy. Helen scoffed, but his dead-eyed stare forces her immediate submission. This reveals a harsh clinical truth. Real change rarely stems from sudden moral awakenings, but from the cold calculation that destructive habits are no longer useful to our survival. Catherine demands empirical proof his sociopathic identity is dead. Roman maintains unblinking eye contact. He catalogs the behavioral evidence: syndicates dismantled, capital diverted, and 15 silent scholarships. He simply upgraded his weapons from brass knuckles to boardroom manipulation. Harrison asks the trigger question: what external stimulus caused this predator to rewrite his baseline? Roman turns his calculating gaze toward Nina. His voice adopts an unsettling reverence. He claims she mirrored a new identity back to him. The table stares at Nina, her face flushing with the autonomic response of a captive. Stick with me. This is where it gets interesting. Even a megalomaniac narcissist needs a mirror. When one person reflects an idealized version of the captor, it becomes an incredibly potent psychological lifeline. Catherine asserts dominance, coercing Helen into delivering a humiliating apology. The shouting ceases, but the emotional shrapnel has already triggered severe somatic symptoms in Nina, leaving her nauseous. Later, Catherine isolates Nina in the chill of the courtyard. The social camouflage is discarded entirely. Catherine looks directly at Nina, identifying her as the exact stabilizing agent Roman's pathology requires. For 8 years, Catherine observed him operate as an untouchable god of violence. Witnessing his calculated vulnerability tonight was a staggering behavioral deviation. It creates a fascinating cognitive dissonance. We categorize these individuals purely as monsters. yet they occasionally peel back their armor to expose a raw dependency that deeply complicates our assessment of their humanity. Moonlight highlights Catherine's face as she pressures Nina to remain. She is officially assigning Nina the burden of regulating a sociopath's impulses. Nina's anxiety spikes into full-blown panic. She stammers her rationalization. This is merely a transactional contract to erase debt. Catherine's smirk challenges this denial, questioning if the bond still feels financial. Before Nina processes this cognitive dissonance, Roman's silhouette appears. He claims her, his hand settling against her spine with possessive tenderness. Inside the enclosed space of the sedan, the oxygen feels completely depleted. Nina fights a rising panic attack. It is the terrifying moment a captive realizes their mental fortress for self-preservation has already been systematically dismantled from the inside. The silence inside the vehicle is suffocating. Nina's brain fires erratically, processing the evening's events. The tension ruptures when Roman deploys an unexpected tactic. Apologizing for Helen's assault, Nina turns, experiencing profound cognitive dissonance. Why would a megalomaniac hand his adversaries the truth of his past? Roman exhales, simulating the fatigue of a burdened man. He calculates that sustaining a fabricated narrative is simply inefficient. To secure a legitimate empire, he must own his monstrous history. He meets her gaze, reinforcing her role by reminding her she challenged him. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Absolute control isn't hiding a violent record. It is the sheer audacity to drag your darkest atrocities into the light and dare anyone to pass judgment. City lights strobe through the tinted glass. Nina voices the core symptom of her Stockholm Syndrome. Does she genuinely believe she is rewriting his sociopathic DNA? Roman utilizes an effective manipulation tactic. He confesses uncertainty, insisting her presence compels him toward morality. This permanently binds her to him. Back at the penthouse, Nina braces for his emotional withdrawal. Instead, he pivots, pouring 2 drinks and demanding the unvarnished history of Mariavale. Roman bypasses the myth to dissect the human baseline. Nina describes a woman of iron resilience who sacrificed everything. This maps perfectly onto our clinical architecture. We are all stitched together from the traumas of our caregivers. To decode a subject's behavioral loop, you must always excavate their roots. Nina exhibits profound emotional dysregulation. Her silhouette trembles against the glass as she details her mother's trauma, a woman who endured severe deprivation just to dance. Her voice breaks on the catastrophic timing. Her mother succumbed 14 days before the studio's opening. Paralyzed by survivor's guilt, Nina admits that seeking asylum with a kingpin feels like a betrayal of that legacy. Roman places his glass down. He crosses the room, executing a brilliant psychological reframe. He justifies her presence by reminding her this illicit arrangement actively funds 60 students. You and I know how cognitive distortions operate during grief. The brain fixates on perceived failures, entirely blinding the subject to the fierce resilience they are actually demonstrating to survive. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifts. Roman, an apex predator whose voice typically initiates violence, modulates his tone into a haunting gentleness. He provides absolute validation, assuring her that any mother would endorse an alliance with a psychopath to protect her kin. Nina observes this kingpin, who has mapped her vulnerabilities flawlessly. Caught in the cognitive dissonance of Stockholm Syndrome, she demands his motivation. Roman utilizes silence as a tool. In his ecosystem, subservience is exclusively extracted via terror. Yet she exhibited a rare defiance, demanding a pathological entity suppress its nature. It exposes a fascinating clinical dependency. For a megalomaniac isolated in a void of his own making, Her moral compass serves as his only external stabilizing mechanism. The room is saturated in shadow, yet Roman subverts the expected behavioral loop. The sociopathic smirk vanishes. He hypothesizes aloud that fear is no longer the exclusive currency of their ecosystem. He abruptly terminates the interaction, abandoning her to weaponize his absence and induce acute separation anxiety. The contractual boundary is clinically obliterated. Over a 3-period they navigate a high-risk matrix of syndicate gatherings. Nina actively adapts, mapping the tells of apex predators disguised in tailored suits. Her neuroplasticity shifts to accommodate extreme threat levels. This is the undeniable prognosis of prolonged trauma exposure. When a subject remains immersed in a pathological environment, the darkness fundamentally rewrites their neural architecture. We observe a cognitive shift within the megalomaniac. His psychopathic baseline remains intact, yet Roman integrates Nina into his operational core. He solicits her assessment of an investor named Patterson. Recognizing the hunger of a fellow predator, Nina diagnoses Patterson as an active threat. Exhibiting impossible trust for a paranoid kingpin, Roman instantly severs the association. His physical touch, a heavy palm anchored to her spine at these galas, serves as a primary behavioral tell. The gesture is pure territorial dominance. Masked by an illusion of tenderness, let us review this final analysis together. Genuine psychological control isn't measured by violent outbursts used to eradicate enemies, but by the calculated restraint carefully deployed to secure a captive's absolute loyalty. Let us examine the subject Roman. As a megalomaniac narcissist, he dictates her isolation by presenting gilded cages as sanctuaries to enforce dependency. At 2 a.m, an external variable shatters this space. Nina receives a horrifying call. Her mother's dance studio, the final tether to her independent identity, has been violently desecrated. Surrounded by shattered mirrors, her trauma response is absolute panic. She dials the very captor she swore to avoid. Roman answers immediately, positioning himself as the savior. You and I must understand this behavioral mechanism. When the mind's defenses are breached by terror, the victim will inevitably sprint into the arms of the monster, mistaking his absolute control for a safe haven. The facade of the untouchable boss evaporates instantly. His charm vanishes, replaced by the primal hypervigilance of a predator securing his possession. He issues harsh directives to his guards before pulling Nina into the vehicle. During the transit, his knuckles grip the wheel with a bone-white intensity. They arrive to find her sanctuary reduced to splinters and jagged glass. The malicious graffiti acts as a calculated psychological strike against her stability. As Nina confronts the ruin, acute despair paralyzes her motor functions. Predictably, Roman anchors his heavy arm over her shaking shoulders. In moments of catastrophic loss, the human psyche clings to whatever solid mass is available, even if that mass is a fundamental part of the surrounding nightmare. "We will fix it," he informs her, his voice dropping to a regulated, chilling frequency. He mobilizes his subterranean network to trace the perpetrators. When an investigator casually dismisses the damage as random vandalism, Roman subjects the man to a predatory stare. The underworld meaning is transparent to him. This wreckage is a codified message from a rival. Meanwhile, Nina exhibits classic symptoms of dissociation, drifting through the debris, detached from her reality. Once law enforcement vacates the premises, Roman locates her collapsed on the splintered floorboards. When a victim's identity is obliterated, they enter a state of extreme pliability. They become incredibly susceptible to anyone willing to sit beside them in the dirt and offer a dangerous solution. He crouches in the debris, adopting the posture of a king surveying a ruined territory. "This is my fault," Nina whispers, demonstrating the internalized guilt typical of trauma bonding. A rival targeted her to inflict psychological damage upon the narcissist. Roman seizes her hands, vowing lethal retribution. But examine this interaction closely. Nina asserts a boundary, physically pulling away to reject his violent methodology. Recognizing that losing her compliance is unacceptable, Roman adapts. He will use his massive corporate assets to financially suffocate his enemies instead. He dispatches a restoration crew by dawn, re-establishing his grip on her life. For a predator, modifying a violent tactic is merely a calculated method to ensure absolute dominance over his chosen subject. Nina experiences a brief cognitive rebellion against his interference. However, physiological exhaustion rapidly depletes her mental defenses. Surrounded by the ruin of her personal history, she surrenders, murmuring her consent. During the transit back to his fortified penthouse, she realizes her status as a psychological pawn in a territorial war. Let us consider this stage of conditioning. A subject cannot indefinitely withstand a prolonged emotional siege. Eventually, the exhausted mind categorizes submission to the captor as the safest available survival strategy. By noon, operatives extract the security footage. Roman observes the monitor, his facial micro-expressions solidifying into pure homicidal intent. Victor Hastings is identified. The bloody escalation phase begins. The hired operatives display sheer incompetence by leaving their faces exposed. Nina quickly deciphers the motive. Hastings, suffering a deep narcissistic injury, executed this strike to prove the untouchable Roman possesses vulnerabilities. The behavioral shift in Roman is stark. He abandons his baseline aggression for an absolute, psychopathic stillness. It is the regulated respiration of a predator locking onto its target. He silently commits to a lethal resolution. Nina irrationally attempts to intervene, pleading with him to exhibit moral superiority. Yet, her clinical mistake is entirely predictable. When a subject attempts to negotiate with an antisocial personality, extending an olive branch is interpreted strictly as a fatal weakness meant to be violently exploited. The footage captures a fascinating shift. The territorial possessiveness in Roman's tone should trigger her flight response. Instead, it deepens her psychological attachment, a hallmark symptom of Stockholm Syndrome. She pleads with this apex predator to abandon his violent impulses. When he dismisses her, Nina pivots her methodology. She attacks his intellect, asking what inflicts greater trauma on a narcissist: a physical beating, or the complete obliteration of his empire. The strategy is flawless. Roman calculates the superior impact of a corporate assassination over a crude execution. Influencing a dangerous mind is rarely achieved through moral pleas. It is accomplished by expertly redirecting their inherent sadistic drives toward a more sophisticated form of devastation. The studio will be operational in 10 days, he dictates, constructing a suffocating matrix of surveillance around her. When Nina resists, he clinically dismantles her objections by citing her upcoming recital. Recognizing her pride poses a risk to others, her defiance collapses. As she exhibits compliance, Roman administers a tactical dose of positive reinforcement. His fingertips delicately brush a lock of hair behind her ear. The juxtaposition of a violent individual executing such a gentle maneuver creates severe cognitive dissonance within the subject. A phone vibration interrupts this conditioning. The megalomaniac instantly withdraws into his frozen exterior. Often, the most efficient psychological survival mechanism is the total suppression of the ego, quietly submitting to the protective architecture built by a monster. Hastings made his move. "Now I execute mine," Rome declares. The heavy door seals shut, submerging him into the psychopathic machinery of his empire. Observe the subject, Nina. She remains perfectly motionless, fixated on the thermal memory of his touch. For 7 days, the penthouse functions as a sterile isolation chamber. He operates as an unseen force, orchestrating a silent war. Concurrently, her studio is reconstructed with suspicious efficiency, immaculate oak floors, flawless mirrors. Her associates express profound relief, entirely failing to detect the illicit capital financing their beautiful sanctuary. The human psyche has a remarkable capacity for denial. We eagerly bathe in the lavish rewards of our environment, remaining willfully blind to the brutal sociopathy required to harvest them from the freezing dark. Nina watches an associate trace the pristine mirrors. He clearly values craftsmanship, she states, executing a deception to mask the violent syndicate politics, subsidizing this miracle. This fragile psychological construct collapses on the 6th morning. An agitated call from Catherine instructs Nina to review the financial indices. Victor Hastings has been systematically eradicated, investors evaporated, financial institutions severed his lifeblood. It is a textbook corporate assassination executed with clinical precision and zero biological spillage. Observe this pathological adaptation closely. When a victim successfully convinces an apex predator to abandon physical violence, the predator simply recalibrates. They engineer a sophisticated methodology to silently asphyxiate their target without ever leaving a single forensic trace behind. You and I have tracked this subject, adopting the mask of a refined gentleman. Now, Catherine forces Nina into a harsh cognitive confrontation. Roman has just annihilated a man's existence without raising his vocal register. Nina attempts to rationalize our proximity by citing their contract. Catherine shatters this denial, noting that a sociopathic wolf in designer garments still possesses lethal teeth. Isolated, Nina is submerged in acute guilt, realizing her attempt to modify his behavior merely amplified his destructive efficiency. Later, Roman manifests. His features reflect severe psychological depletion. He consumes a glass of liquor in a mechanical swallow, confirming his rival is finished. A clinical truth emerges here. You can drape severe pathology in silk and condition it to smile, but its primal hunger will always demand a devastating release. Visualize an entity willing to incinerate a forest to eliminate one single serpent. This is Roman's behavioral matrix. He clinically informs Nina his adversary is reduced to ash. Nina scrutinizes his micro-expressions, seeking evidence of psychological equilibrium. Instead, she observes a profound, hollow ache. There is no dopamine release in this triumph. He remains incarcerated by a brutal code demanding the complete eradication of threats to his possessions. Demonstrating advanced trauma bonding, Nina crosses the room, extracting the glass from his rigid grip. She registers his elevated heart rate against her palm as he catalogs the dark favors he traded. The clinical diagnosis is always grim. Retaliative destruction never reconstructs a fractured psyche. It merely expands the suffocating vacuum inside the subject's mind, leaving behind a much colder, permanent reality. Let us open this case file together and examine the pathology. We observe Roman, a classic megalomaniacal narcissist, rationalizing his behavior. Economic ruin, he murmurs, is crueler than physical trauma. Because broken bones heal, they sit in a clinical silence while Nina processes her reality. This apex predator dismantled a man's life just to keep her secure. Roman confesses a bitter regret. He desires to construct something beautiful, yet destruction is his native tongue. Nina points to the restored studio as proof of his humanity. But he rejects it. Darkness is simply more efficient, he admits. We find a profound behavioral truth here, The most terrifying trigger for a sociopathic mind is never a violent turf war. It is the sudden, blinding introduction of peace. We see a subject drowning in his own violent history, desperately seeking an anchor. His scarred hand reaches across the space lacing his Stockholm Syndrome. Through classic Stockholm Syndrome, Nina makes him believe peace might exist. When she asks why he fights his darker impulses so fiercely, Roman delivers a chillingly dependent truth. He finally has a reason to be a better man. Panic flares in her chest as she reminds him their 6-month contract is half over. Roman calmly traces her trembling wrist, inquiring about her next move. 2 months ago, her survival instinct would have demanded she run. Now, severing the trauma bond feels like tearing the breath from her lungs. The clinical lesson is tragic but real. Sometimes, the exact mechanism that saves our psyche is the very one we are scheduled to permanently leave behind. Roman pulls his captive against his chest, promising they will stabilize the situation. They remain anchored in the dark until psychological exhaustion drags him under. Draping a blanket over his shoulders, Nina wonders when their sterile, transactional deal mutated into this consuming trauma bond. Time marches on, and the resurrected dance studio opens its doors. The room is a warm sea of joyous children and weeping parents. Then the unthinkable behavioral anomaly occurs. Roman steps out of the shadows. He looks entirely alien amidst the bright costumes, a dark, observing statue in the back row. Yet the narcissist chose the light today. Watching this adaptation, Nina uncovers a profound truth. True psychological rehabilitation never magically erases a violent past. It simply plants a small, quiet garden right on top of the heavy, lingering ashes of destruction. Nina observes from the wings, her chest aching with a complex, conditioned fullness. As the stage clears, Roman materializes beside her, moving with the silent efficiency of a predator. His dark, analyzing eyes scan the joyful families. He needed to witness the vibrant life his blood-stained hands actually helped rebuild, he confesses. His heavy palm settles on the curve of her spine. It is a physical trigger she once feared, but now desperately craves, due to her psychological conditioning. He murmurs that this sanctuary is proof that beautiful things can grow without being watered by terror. A ruthless syndicate boss stands in a bright room, aching to guard a fragile light. It brings us to a harsh clinical reality. Choosing to patiently heal and build is always infinitely more painful to the human psyche than choosing to simply destroy. We understand how fragile an unguarded psychological state can be. Nina holds his gaze, whispering that he is not the monster his history suggests. Roman stares back with naked vulnerability, a rare break in his narcissistic armor. He confesses his sole remaining motivation is to become a man worthy of her. Before that cognitive shift can fully anchor, a violent crash echoes from the alley. The intimacy shatters instantly. Roman's posture snaps rigid. His impenetrable Mafia armor locks back into place, burying his humanity behind a mask of chilling, sociopathic ice. Later, staring at the ceiling, Nina confronts her reality. She is irrevocably attached to the true Roman, the broken man, seeking impossible rehabilitation. The behavioral lesson here is absolute. Deep emotional attachment rarely bothers to ask for our logical permission before it completely takes over. A glowing message from her captor pierces the dark. He thanks her for showing him a reality worth protecting. Nina types a cautious reply, and his response is an unshakable, obsessive vow. Over the next 3 weeks, the rigid parameters of their arrangement dissolve into a haze of conditioned responses and lingering touches. To his fractured mind, she is the solitary lighthouse in a storm. Yet, this behavioral pause is merely the dead air before a hurricane. The illusion shatters when her brother Josh breaches her defenses. She had ignored his frantic calls, burying her familial trauma under her new captor romance. When she answers, Josh is weeping, begging for his life. The psychological lesson is entirely unavoidable. Avoidance only ever grants our hidden guilt and lingering pain a much more fertile environment to fester and grow. You and I must analyze this pivotal rupture. Josh's voice splinters through the speaker, collapsing under the weight of a fabricated debt. Roman is systematically extorting $5,000 a month from him. One missed payment equals absolute ruin. The floor drops out from beneath Nina's feet. She explicitly ordered that gambling debt erased. Then the horrifying cognitive dissonance resolves. She asked a ruthless crime boss to teach her brother a firm lesson. But to an apex predator, teaching means applied psychological torture. We must acknowledge a brutal clinical reality. When you invite a literal wolf to guard your fragile flock, you cannot act shocked when he bares his fangs. Nina hollowly promises to fix the nightmare, her hands trembling as her illusion of a gentle protector instantly turns to ash. Nina breaches the heavy office doors like a tempest. Roman rises instantly from his desk, clinically calculating the raw betrayal burning in her face. She demands to know why he is suffocating her brother under a fake debt. Roman does not even flinch. The fleeting warmth drains entirely from his expression. He slips right back into the cold mechanics of a megalomaniacal boss. He calmly reminds her that she requested Josh face real consequences. To a criminal mastermind, psychological terror is not cruelty. It is simply an efficient behavioral modification strategy. The gambling stopped, did it not? This reveals a tragic psychological lesson. Two people can witness the exact same event, yet inhabit entirely different mental realities. Nina sees the malicious crushing of her bloodline, while Roman genuinely believes he solved her problem perfectly. We observe Nina as her composure completely shatters, her voice cracking while describing her brother's paralyzing terror over a missed payment. Roman stands in the dim light, his response chillingly pragmatic. Fear, he states, is an unparalleled motivational tool. That clinical cruelty hits her like a physical blow. She fires back, accusing him of torturing her family simply to flex his absolute narcissistic dominance. For the first time, the subject's iron facade violently cracks. He roars that he followed her exact parameters. She forbade physical violence, so he weaponized crushing economic terror instead. He tells her she cannot have both the monster and the good man. She must finally make a choice. It leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. We constantly demand that subjects change for us, yet we reject the messy, imperfect reality of their evolution. Nina makes her brutally simple choice in the dead silence of the examination room. She chooses her bloodline. She refuses to remain bonded to a man who uses her family's sanity as a mere chess piece. Roman instantly retreats behind his impenetrable pathological walls. His jaw clenched tight. The boss stares her down, coldly reminding her that Josh squandered $300,000. In his twisted cognitive framework, every single drop of that terror was earned. Nina demands he pick up the phone right now and wipe the slate clean. Roman does not even blink before dropping a hard, absolute refusal. Her brother pays the phantom debt, or he faces the consequences. You can practically hear the psychological string snap inside Nina. She yanks off her heavy diamond bracelet and slams it onto the desk. Sometimes, walking away from toxic manipulation is the ultimate victory. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? You simply cannot rehabilitate a subject who uses his own brokenness as an impenetrable shield. Nina finally breaks the Stockholm Syndrome, telling Roman to let his cold, violent empire keep him warm. She turns her back, and the untouchable narcissist completely shatters. He chases her out to the elevator, a ruthless mastermind suddenly reduced to a panicked, desperate mess. He begs her, promising to call Josh and undo his behavioral conditioning. But Nina holds up a brutal mirror, reminding him that when threatened, his default state is psychological manipulation. He complains she is being unfair. Nina delivers a devastating blow, whispering that life is never fair, which is the exact lesson his cruelty forced her to learn. You simply cannot save a patient who actively chooses their pathology over your intervention. Nina presses the button, watching the metal doors slide shut, physically severing the trauma bond that held her captive. Up in the cavernous penthouse, she packs her bags with numb, mechanical precision. She is fully prepared to face total financial ruin just to escape his suffocating control. But then Marcuson, the towering enforcer, knocks gently on her door. He delivers a staggering revelation. Roman threw the extortion contract away. The ruthless boss actually called Josh and wiped out the massive debt entirely. Marcus shows her a glowing screen with a text from Roman. It is a simple apology and a quiet promise that the situation is resolved. Seeing those impossibly vulnerable words completely wrecks her psychological defenses. The most sincere apology entirely loses its healing power when it arrives after the foundational trust is already permanently destroyed. Let's examine this clinical file together. Marcus, the enforcer, displays a fascinating trauma bond, whispering that Roman has locked himself away in a state of psychological collapse. For a megalomaniac like Roman, facing his ruinous choices triggers a severe narcissistic injury. Nina initially exhibits healthy self-preservation, insisting the kingpin's wreckage is not her responsibility. Yet, Marcus plants a dangerous cognitive distortion, suggesting a monster's vulnerability is worth observing. Nina freezes. Her trauma response shifts into a textbook manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. She justifies staying through fatigue. But observing an abuser drop his grandiose facade creates a potent illusion of safety. We often mistake our deepest trauma bonds for courage, walking directly back into the cages that destroyed us. Here is where the pathology deepens. Nina breaches the heavy oak doors, completely ignoring the external boundaries. Inside, the untouchable Dawn presents a classic portrait of decompensation. Roman is disheveled, gripping his liquor to self-medicate a fracturing ego. He confesses his interaction with Josh, admitting his sadistic methods crossed an unforgivable line. The narcissist found it darkly amusing that Josh threatened him, knowing he could eliminate the boy instantly. Yet, Roman's megalomania yields to a shocking realization. True dominance is not ruling a violent syndicate, but commanding genuine loyalty. Nina's psychological defenses soften. Her captor is mirroring human empathy, pulling her deeper into the syndrome. The people we exhaust ourselves trying to shield often provide the exact psychological anchor we need to survive our darkest terrors. Roman sets his glass down, attempting to shed the sociopathic persona that dictates his existence. He rationalizes his violence toward Josh not as sadism, but as a misguided instructional method, a common cognitive dissonance among career criminals. Watching his psychological armor fracture is highly instructive. He admits his inability to distinguish between harsh tutelage and pure monstrous behavior. In his paranoid reality, extending is perceived as a fatal weakness. Nina challenges this distortion, firmly stating that human beings are not mere extensions of his ego. Roman experiences visible physiological distress. For a man defined by supreme control, admitting fault registers in his brain as a mortal threat. He struggles to verbalize his remorse. The impenetrable walls we construct to block out pain inevitably become the solitary confinement cells that ensure our isolation. Roman takes a ragged breath, verbally confronting the reality that his compulsive need for dominance has eroded his capacity for empathy. Then, a rare psychiatric anomaly occurs. The narcissist issues a genuine apology. Witnessing this ruthless figure strip away his massive cognitive dissonance for Nina creates massive cognitive dissonance for Nina. Instead of fleeing, her Stockholm Syndrome intensifies. She mirrors his vulnerability, rescinding her diagnosis of him as a lost cause. Roman displays depressive affect, acknowledging his addiction to inducing fear as a pathetic coping mechanism. Ignoring the glaring threat he poses, Nina steps closer, empathizing with the psychological torture of dismantling his survival instincts. We spend decades constructing elaborate mental barricades, only to become hopelessly entangled with our abusers the exact second those heavy defenses begin to fracture. Nina exhibits profound trauma bonding, whispering a confession that illustrates her psychological capture. She admits her terror stems not from his violence, but from her irrational investment. A desperate need, really. In his moral rehabilitation, Roman approaches, his hands framing her face while exhibiting physiological tremors. This architect of a blood-soaked empire is experiencing a total breakdown of his megalomania. He questions the utility of his power, realizing narcissistic supply cannot cure chronic isolation. He admits his inability to prioritize affection over his obsessive need for control, yet expresses a desperate willingness to change. Nina anchors herself to his pulse. The moment you allow another individual to penetrate your psychological defenses, you hand them the capacity to destroy you. Yet taking that risk remains the only cure for emotional paralysis. You and I are going to analyze this critical turning point together. Nina maintains eye contact, attempting to establish a clinical boundary. She correctly identifies that she cannot act as his psychiatric savior. The cognitive restructuring must be his own burden. Roman exhibits severe dependency, pleading for her to serve as his external conscience. While every rational survival instinct screams at her to evacuate, her Stockholm Syndrome dictates otherwise. She initiates physical intimacy. Roman responds with desperate intensity, clinging to her as a psychological life raft. Upon separating, Nina attempts to renegotiate their reality, insisting the toxic power dynamic is terminated and demanding equality. Genuine attachment offers no empirical guarantees. It merely provides the shared belief that leaping into a terrifying future will yield a meaningful outcome. Nina separates, establishing rigid behavioral parameters. Her ultimatum is absolute. To maintain this connection, his criminal infrastructure must be eradicated. Roman's facial micro-expressions harden, calculating the probability of violent retaliation. In his paranoid worldview, a power vacuum inevitably invites bloodshed. He perceives her demand as a lethal ultimatum between his megalomaniacal identity and psychological redemption. Yet, Nina expertly blocks his attempt to adopt a victim complex. She clinically forces him to confront his existential legacy, whether to expire as an isolated psychopath or construct a reality grounded in actual human connection. Driven by this psychological pressure, Roman initiates the dismantling of his syndicate. You cannot construct a rehabilitated existence without first finding the resolve to incinerate the toxic ruins of your past pathology. Now, listen to the behavioral shift occurring here. The former narcissist issues severe directives, forcing the liquidation of his illicit assets. Severing the call, Roman exhibits extreme physical tension, confronting the objective reality of their situation. He strips away all grandiosity, admitting that disentangling his finances from fellow antisocial personalities will inevitably invite extreme violence. Exhibiting a rare display of protective affection, He bluntly informs her that permanent safety is no longer attainable. Nina processes the clinical insanity of her decision to marked for termination. Nevertheless, her Stockholm Syndrome holds firm. She commits to navigating the violent fallout. Psychological correction is never sterile. True cognitive growth requires planting your feet and fighting back when the severe consequences of your past arrive for collection. The lighting highlights the absolute collapse of Nina's self-preservation instincts. She challenges a highly lethal predator, clinically questioning if his fragile megalomania can endure genuine intimacy. Roman displays a predatory affect, warning her that emotional transparency is a neurological pathway he has never developed. Physical contact initiates, and he pulls her into a highly enmeshed embrace, shattering the established captor-captive hierarchy. He proposes she cohabitate in his penthouse, no longer as a subjected victim, but as a perceived equal. The notoriously articulate psychopath, her rational mind maps the escape routes. But the syndrome forces her verbal compliance. But the syndrome, here is a clinical truth we all face. Relinquishing our defensive armor is a profoundly agonizing surrender. And this specific emotional surrender is about to be dragged through absolute hell. We are about to uncover the violent extinction burst that followed. Roman's assessment of the threat matrix was entirely accurate. His subordinates initiate a coordinated mutiny, weaponizing litigation to trap him. Competing antisocial networks target his assets, culminating in the explosive demolition of a key facility. The underworld enforces its primary rule. Exit requires a body bag. Nina observes his neurological regression as he reverts to the cold, calculating traits of a warlord. He hemorrhages financial resources simply to avoid homicidal retaliation. The cognitive dissonance causes acute insomnia. He paces obsessively, fighting his hard-wired compulsion to inflict violence. You and I understand this clinical reality. Authentic psychological rehabilitation is horrific. It is an exhausting daily battle against deeply ingrained sadistic instincts, especially when reverting to the monster is easiest. Observe the hypervigilance in Nina's body language. She becomes an expert in decoding his physical microexpressions, studying the clenched jaw of a patient conditioned entirely by extreme violence. Her demand that he disarm is not mere pacification. It is a direct intervention aimed at dismantling decades of antisocial reinforcement. Inside their isolated environment, Roman paces like a caged predator, expressing severe aversion to any perceived loss of autonomy. Nina invades his personal space, offering a profound cognitive reframe. She defines his nonviolence not as submission, but as the supreme exercise of executive function. By repressing his violent urges, he destroys his psychological prison. The underlying clinical truth is universal. Genuine neurological rewiring is terrifying. It requires discarding the defenses that ensured our survival and handing the scalpel to the person capable of inflicting maximum emotional damage. Open this case file with me and examine the mind of a rehabilitated predator. In the heavy silence, Roman draws Nina to his chest. Clinically, I observe a megalomaniac narcissist, terrified by the pathology he once wielded. They establish a delicate rhythm. By day, Nina redirects displaced youth. By night, Roman dismantles his criminal syndicate, brick by bloody brick. Polite society tentatively opens its doors. His name still induces a chill, yet his systematic cleansing is undeniable. 10 months later, the anomaly is verified. He is clean. The psychological takeaway here is quite beautiful. No subject is irrevocably tethered to their darkest pathology. A fractured psyche often merely requires one stable hand to pull it entirely out of the violent abyss. A year elapses, and the elite finally accommodate the kingpin. Catherine Weller assures Nina the public perceives his shift. Yet, Nina experiences tremors in her hands, questioning if one can eradicate a violent history. Catherine states the past is static, but the future is unwritten, identifying the glaring diagnosis. Nina is exhibiting profound Stockholm syndrome, deeply enamored with her captor. She has suppressed this trauma bond, fearing vocalization might shatter their equilibrium. Repressing psychological truth induces a slow decay. That night, Nina observes Roman scanning his former territory. Stepping from the shadows, she embraces his waist, allowing her defensive barriers to collapse. She chooses the danger of her trauma bond over the illusion of absolute safety. Roman rotates from the glass. The sociopathic mask he utilized for decades dissolves, exposing a fractured affect. He pulls her against his chest, admitting he waited agonizing months for her to cross that psychological boundary. His grip indicates she is his primary tether. With uncalculated desperation, he asks her to marry him. This is no strategic alliance. The megalomaniac simply desires to prove his worth to her. The clinical lesson here is stark. Genuine attachment is never about sourcing an undamaged specimen. It involves selecting an individual willing to execute the brutal cognitive restructuring of their own pathology. In the dim lighting, the apex predator assumes a submissive posture on one knee, offering an entirely new behavioral baseline. You and I must analyze this pivotal juncture. Positioned submissively, Roman is stripped of his narcissistic defenses. He recalls her initial intrusion, the catalyst that dismantled his empire. Presenting a simple band, he confesses she rewired his brain from destructive toward constructive impulses. Deep within her Stockholm syndrome, Nina observes the man who neutralized his reign of terror for her and accepts. 6 months later, they execute a private marital ritual. Her brother Josh escorts her, having endured 2 years of behavioral testing in Roman's enterprise to validate his integration. The irony is clinically profound. Sometimes, our most catastrophic pathological errors provide the exact resilience required to architect a sustainable psychological recovery. At the altar, Josh threatens retaliation should Roman induce emotional trauma. Nina detects only transparency in his gaze. Predictably, symbolic rings do not instantly repair neural pathways. Their first year constitutes a volatile psychological battlefield. The hyper-vigilant reflexes that ensured Roman survival violently collide with domestic tranquility. Nina refuses to exhibit a fear response, systematically forcing him to extinguish his reactive hostility until an equilibrium is established. This represents a bitter clinical reality. One cannot simply mask structural rot. You must violently deconstruct your previous behavioral model before a healthy one can operate. By year 2, his legitimate technological revenues successfully suppress the phantom echoes of his illicit capital. Observe the data over the next 3 years. The formidable crime boss ceases to exist, replaced by a subdued corporate operative. Nina establishes 4 additional youth sanctuaries. Seeking isolation, they procure a forested residence. The subject's rigid posture dissolves upon the birth of their daughter. Analyze this specimen, accustomed to inflicting trauma, now displaying reverent attachment toward an infant. 2 years later, a son is born. They name him Marcus, an homage to the operative who bled out to preserve their lives. Upon verbalizing this name, the former sociopath experiences a physiological collapse, violently weeping. When a subject conditioned solely for destruction manifests in voluntary spasms of selfless affection, the violent pathological cycle is definitively broken. Their environmental baseline stabilizes. The communal dread evaporates. Roman redirects his megalomaniacal obsession for control into legitimate corporate dominance. The critical deviation is his consistent return to the domestic unit. It is a diagnostic irony to observe a former cartel architect instructing pediatric athletic teams. Yet, cognitive remnants persist. On their 5th anniversary, Nina discovers him anonymously liquidating a civilian's medical debt, but experiences vocal tremors. Scrutinizing his hands, he verbalizes a profound imposter syndrome. He articulates a paralyzing dread that his philanthropy is merely a narcissistic facade, a cowardly maneuver to neurologically launder the accumulated blood from his psyche. In the shadows, he asks if altruistic actions retain validity when motivated by the need to suppress the guilt of past victims. Nina applies tactile pressure to his temple, a grounding technique to short-circuit his spiraling cognition, stating the beneficiaries are indifferent to his neuroses. The somatic impact is immediate. He constricts his grip, stating without her, he would be decomposing in isolation. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? A clinician provides the framework, but the subject must navigate the trauma. Nina evaluates her progression from a traumatized hostage to the regulatory mechanism of an apex predator. The clinical fact is undeniable. A psyche formulated via terror can be completely eradicated and re-engineered using the immovable metrics of radical empathy. Accelerating the timeline by 10 years yields the ultimate behavioral result. They stand in a philanthropic entity Roman engineered. Nina observes fractured family units receiving the interventions she once required. The apex of his rehabilitations is the metallic text above the entrance, bearing her deceased mother's name. Roman interlaces his scarred digits with hers, soliciting her thoughts. She hypothesizes her mother would have diagnosed her with psychiatric dysfunction for bonding with a crime architect. Roman emits a low laugh, aware she would have perceived the human beneath the sociopathic conditioning. They successfully excised a violently antisocial existence, subjected it to intense psychological friction, and systematically synthesized a locus of societal stability. He draws her close, acknowledging a flight response was her only neurologically sound protocol. Nina shuts her eyes, processing their survival. She analyzes the initial panic, the clinical agony of monitoring an apex predator as he rewired his neural pathways toward restorative outputs. She verbalizes mutual appreciation, validating the subject who executed her behavioral mandates. They inhabit a city that processes his identity with reverence. Outside, their offspring engage in trivial conflict, a flawlessly mundane baseline. You and I can observe the psychological paradox here. The most lethal organisms often formulate the most reliable symbiotic bonds. Subjects who forcibly extract themselves from sociopathic darkness will instinctively deploy maximum aggression to preserve their equilibrium. A subject with the sociopathic drive to incinerate a crime network has the cognitive rigidity to construct an impenetrable behavioral framework. Roman analyzed the underworld and actively selected his bond with Nina. He relinquished dominance so his lineage could process his identity without cognitive dissonance. Clinically, true victory is not quantified by capital. It exists in the deliberate neurological choice to synthesize rather than dismantle. Upon initial exposure to his terrifying radius, Nina hypothesized her psychological integrity would be the collateral for survival. As his digits interlace with hers, the case file closes on a severe deviation from the mean. She did not disintegrate within the pathology. She simply identified a symbiotic attachment that logically justified the requisite emotional hemorrhaging.